My father was always obsessed with hunting. We lived, fortunately, in middle of nowhere Texas, where the nearest gas station was about a 30-minute drive away. This meant going grocery shopping was a luxury my parents couldn't afford, so most of our food was either grown or hunted. I have fond memories of my mother making Mama's surprise, whatever was seasonally grown and whatever my father slung over his shoulder and hauled back at the end of the day. Due to the fact we lived in the middle of nowhere, I didn't get much interaction with other people and didn't really understand how things worked for a long time. My mother attempted to homeschool me, but that just consisted of learning how to prepare meat properly and how to hide from Dad when he came home after a day of not catching anything. I loved those lessons from my mother. We would stand side by side as she would pluck the chickens and I would chop the carrots and the broccoli. My father also homeschooled me, but that was just him showing me his second obsession, taxidermy. "You need to honor the animal, son," he would exclaim with a deep intensity, wrapping an arm around my shoulders as he marveled at his handiwork. The head of a deer that I watched him hack off was nailed onto a mount on the wall. The skin stretched over a crooked wooden armature, lolling to the side slightly with the weight of it. Its glass eyes shined with a quiet misery that I couldn't quite place at 10 years old. The rest of the deer's body was stuffed as well. Put in a standing position, my father had broken one of its legs carrying it home, so the body looked lopsided and wobbling on an unsteady gait. I always hated it. The basement downstairs was full of them. Bears, foxes, wolves, deer, ducks, you name it. It was crudely stuffed with wool and hay and kept in the basement like a museum. Dad treated them with a disturbing reverence. At 16, my father started coming home with food less and less. Something about the population drying out in the area and that he had to widen his hunting range. The woods were big enough after all. I heard him and my mother having heated arguments about it a lot, until one day he picked up his rifle and left us with a final slam of the porch door. My mother really wasn't the same after that. No more lessons in preparing food, no more laughing and joking, just scrubbing the same fork for hours on end as she stared vacantly out of the window. She became a whisper of a woman. I hated my father for making her like this. I thought he'd left us forever until a month later he came back with 2 sopping bags of meat. He shoved them in my mother's hands and barked at her to cook dinner. She stiffly turned around and walked into the kitchen to begin preparing it. I followed after her to ask if maybe I could help. "Mama, do you want me to help? It would be nice, we haven't cooked together in so low dash." She slammed her hands onto the counter. "Go to your room." "But dash, don't make me repeat myself. That's no food for you. Go and think about what you've done." This uncharacteristic rage made me physically jump. She'd never even so much as raised her voice towards me, let alone scream at me. I walked into my room mostly confused than anything. This kept happening. Dad would come home, tell her to cook dinner, and she would scream at me for nothing and send me to my room. All of our dinners now were some wilted vegetables and some dry meat. My mother would never, ever let me in the kitchen when she was preparing dinner. My mother had become so thin. Her normally round, smiling face was replaced with gaunt cheekbones and ribs that poked out of her paper-thin skin. My father would scream at her for not cooking me dinner and come into my room with a plate later. I really didn't like whatever he kept bringing home, but it was that or going to bed hungry. It was stringy and chewy and dry at the same time, not like the stuff I was used to. They would argue again, and then he would disappear into the basement for the rest of the night. If I listened hard enough, late at night, I could hear her sobbing from the kitchen. There was one night in particular that I sat with my ear at the door so I could hear them clearly. "I can't do this, Mark. I can't do it to him. I can't. Please don't make me do it," my mother gasped, hiccuping with sobs. "You can't act innocent. You're a part of it too," he hissed. "Well, I don't want to be anymore. You're sick, Mark. You're sick. I endured it for this long. It was a last resort. But you've taken it too fucking far now. Then leave." I heard my mother sniffling, the rustling of some clothes, and the familiar slam of the porch door. My father approached my room with thunderous footsteps that made my adrenaline rush. "I'm going to be gone for a few days. Hunting trip." And with that, he was gone. I was alone. It was 4 weeks of solitude until he returned. My mother still hadn't returned and I was sick with worry. It was deep into the night, and I had came to for a second to be met with that familiar anxiety that my father's presence always brought. I heard him slam open the porch door with a huff and slowly drag what sounded like a large deer down to the entrance of the basement. Bang. He slammed the carcass onto his work table. I knew that bang. I'd heard it so many times I had to properly listen to not tune it out. He would now slice the carcass stomach open and remove all the innards for us to eat. It depended on what parts he wanted to keep, like if he only wanted to mount and stuff the head, he would skin the rest and chop off the parts for us to use in cooking. This sounded like he was wanting to stuff the head. I crept downstairs and walked closer and closer to the door to the basement to hear what he was doing more clearly. I heard the wet splat of the innards going into the bucket to give to me or my mother, and the cracking of tendons and bone as he sawed through the neck. I heard him huff in exhaustion and let out a small laugh. It was quiet for a while, as this part was stuffing and sewing. This silence went on for hours as I assumed he pored over the carcass with meticulous detail. He always did. Honor the animal, as he said. I must have fallen asleep sitting next to the door, as when I stirred the light of the morning poured down the hallway where the basement door was. I heard my father start to move as I quickly became more aware and stumbled to my feet, running and tripping up the stairs as the basement door opened. I went straight into my bed and faced the wall as I pretended to sleep, my father's footsteps close behind. My heart hammered against my chest as he opened the door and crept towards my bed. He loomed over me and lowered his head to whisper in my ear, "Don't go into the basement. I'll know if you do." It was a tense atmosphere for the next few weeks. My father would virtually live in the basement, only going out to hunt and come back in the early hours of the morning. There wasn't a word exchanged between us, but he did always hand over the meat to prepare food with. I knew enough from my mother to survive, and I would dart out into the kitchen to make my food and quickly go back to my room, not wanting to even interact with my father. There was one night, though, that he had made food for me. He left it outside of my room. The meals had downgraded further. It was now just a pile of brown meat slopped onto the plate. No vegetables or sauces. It was either that or going hungry. I had done a lot of that while my father was away and didn't plan to anymore. I retreated back to the safety of my room and began to eat. I was used to the stringy and chewy texture, but this was a lot harder to get through than usual. It was like chewing a belt. I was chewing so harshly that a sudden squishy pop was enough to nauseate me and spit it out. What was left on my plate was a half-chewed eyeball. Optic nerve still intact and sticking to the wet surface of the eye. This was no deer eye or a bear eye or a rabbit eye. It was a human eye. I wanted to cry and vomit at the same time, but all I could do was stare at what was left of it on my plate. I started to hyperventilate as I felt bile rise up my throat, rushing to the bathroom to empty my stomach. My plate clattered to the floor, covering the eye in the brown mincemeat. After gagging over the toilet for an hour, I gathered the courage to pick up my plate and cover up the eye and take it out the back and bury it in the backyard with the rest of our compost. I was glad my father was hiding away in the basement, but I needed answers. I was too afraid to confront him, so my plan was to go into the basement and look at what kind of game he was bringing back out of his widened hunting area. I didn't want to think about the alternative if the deer population was drying out. I waited until the early hours of the morning the next day when I heard for sure my father slamming the porch door behind him. I crept out of my room, towards the door to the basement, my breathing rapid and heart thrumming in my mouth. The door's lock clicked as I turned the handle and pathetically pushed the door open a slice to be met with that familiar stench of rot. But this time much, much stronger. It left a sour taste in the back of my throat that made my stomach churn and my eyes wince, and I padded down the stairs, like I was anticipating something to jump out. I was met with the familiar scene. Bears stood in a permanent roar, deer heads covering every wall and shelf. Rabbits put on pedestals that lined the floor. Antlers covered the door and the furthest wall. Even just standing there gave me chills that ran up my spine. My eyes darted over every mount and pedestal, checking if both eyes were there. To my horror, both eyes were there in every model in the room. I was grasping for answers as I turned around to see my father's newest mount, tucked away behind a stack of wood used for the armatures. There laid, eyes closed serenely, my mother's head. I couldn't move or breathe, for that matter. I was sweating and shaking, but my feet were frozen to the floor. Reaching a shaky hand out, I gently peeled back one of the eyelids. There was nothing there but viscera. In my state of shock, I hadn't heard the porch door open. I felt my stomach drop even further as my father's familiar footsteps thumped down the stairs. Turning the light off, I hurried to hide behind a stack of wood and antlers in the furthest corner of the room. The door opened. I tried to hold my breath and will my presence out of existence. Thump, thump. I'm sure he was over me now, just watching for signs of movement. My hands slowly rose to cover my mouth and muffle my terrified breathing. I was lucky. It was still quite early, so it wasn't light enough to clearly see me unless I made any sudden movements. It felt like hours of him quietly watching me. My eyes were screwed shut from the fear, so I could only hear his breathing. After a while, he tore his eyes away from my exact spot and sat down at his workbench, slamming down his large bag. I watched with wide eyes as he dragged a torso out of the bag and began slicing. The thing with my father was, when he concentrated, he blocked out all sound around him, like getting tunnel vision. I knew if I played it right, I could make a break for the stairs and out the front door. I waited until he was hunched over with his back towards the door to make my escape. I launched myself to my feet, almost tripping over in the process. Our eyes met. My father's eyes were flat and devoid of life, bloodshot and fixed on my position. As I yanked the door open, I could hear him rise from his chair and start to gain on me. In my attempt to crawl up the stairs, he grabbed on to one of my ankles, the air being pushed from my lungs in a weak scream. I struggled and fought and kicked, but his grip was iron tight. He raised his saw he used to cut through the bones of deer and went for my ankle. I was faster and kicked him in the nose with all my might. He let go with an angry scream. I couldn't hear much else except for my pulse roaring in my ears as I crashed through the porch door and into the woods. I turned around for a second to see my father, saw in hand, clutching a bloody nose. I knew if I stopped, he would catch me immediately. I managed to run far enough to hide out in the gas station far, far away from his cabin. Every time I peek my head out from wherever I'm hiding, I swear I can see his silhouette in the distance, watching me, biding his time. As you all know, my father loves to hunt.